What's up, pod pals? It's your buddy Adam, and you are checking out Podcasting Business School. It's the show where I teach podcasters how to love their show like a hobby and build it like a business. And today we're talking about 3 simple tips for better podcast SEO, search engine optimization. And this is a topic that I want to do a little bit of a solo episode deep dive on because I talk about this all the time on my Friday episodes, which are the podcast audits. So when you all sign up and come on for a podcast audit, I'm always talking about these 3 different zones for SEO. So again, I felt like I want to serve you at a better and deeper level by doing a little bit of a deep dive. That way, hopefully that, if you do sign up for a podcast audit later on, you've already got this nailed and you're good to go. And it'll be good for all of us anyway. And it's always good to review search engine optimization periodically and just kind of do a scan through your brand and make sure that you're dialed in. All right. So another reason why I wanted to bring this up is because lately, since I've been obsessing a little bit more on SEO, the last few months, I've really been noticing that my ideal clients, so I'm getting a lot of new clients and I appreciate that. And thank you to everybody that decides to make a commitment at that level. But I always try to reverse engineer the relationship. I'm like, how did you find me? Do you listen to the show? What episodes are your favorite? What made you decide to hire me? I'm always reverse engineering those relationships. And I think that you should too, because that's how we continuously dial in our brand and our content and our marketing and our SEO. But the interesting thing that's been happening over the last several weeks, last couple of months especially, I've got some great clients that I'm just like, wow, you are a dream to work with. How did you find out about me? And every single one of them searched podcasting tips or podcast monetization or podcast growth on a podcast player app and found my show and started listening. So SEO is bringing my ideal clients to my show. And then the content on my show is positioning me as an expert, which we talk about a lot. And they're making that leap into being, from being a community member into being a client, that community client bridge. And that's like a dream scenario. So it's been really interesting to me that they're all like, yeah, I found you on Spotify. I found you on Apple Podcasts. I found you on Overcast FM. And it's not coming from referrals from other people. And that's interesting because most new podcast listeners are listening to new shows based off of referrals. That's still the number one lead generation source as far as acquiring new podcast listeners. So the fact that my ideal clients are just searching terms that I've optimized for on a podcast player app, and they are getting into my stuff and then becoming clients, that's awesome. All right. So I want to give you 3 focus areas that I want you to dial in on a little bit. And we're going to do some cross-referencing, some checks, and make sure that you've got all the main bases covered. All right. So the 3 zones are the name of your podcast, the description of your podcast and your podcast host, and then individual episode titles. And I'm going to give you some tips around all 3 of those zones. So we're going to start off with the name of your podcast. And if you do listen to podcast audit episodes, I would say more than half, maybe even higher percentage of those people, I'm telling them they probably need to rebrand. They probably need to change the name of their show. So I wanted to give you 3 signs and symptoms that you may need a rebrand. You may have missed, swing and a miss on that podcast title, the name of your show. All right. So the name of your show may need to be rebranded, tweaked, changed, demolished and built back up from the ground. So the first sign to look out for is that you have 0 keywords in your title. There's no SEO at all. So like I've rebranded every single show that I've ever launched. I have had that epic fail every single time. So, it's not a big deal. I'm not shaming anybody that needs to rebrand. I've done that with every single show I've ever launched. So we can look at a name like Adam's Journey or something like that. And maybe it's Podcasting Business School, but I think I should name it Adam's Journey or Adam's Business Journey or Adam's Journey into Entrepreneurship or even stuff like that. All right. The words like entrepreneurship, yeah, that's there's a little bit of SEO there, but Podcasting Business School, that's got SEO to it. So That's the first sign or symptom. You've got kind of an obscure title with 0 keywords that your ideal audience would be searching for. That's a sign or symptom that you may need to change the title. The second thing is your ideal listeners have no idea what the show is about once they find it on a podcast player app. So you've done all the work and you're in the right categories, and your ideal listener your show gets put in front of them. They're searching on Apple Podcasts, and there's 20 or so images that pop up, and your show is one of those images, but the title doesn't speak to them. I want your title to be an obvious hell yes or hell no. If the right person sees it, it's got to be a hell yes. That's interesting to me. That title is interesting to me. They'll raise their hand and go, that's for me. Or if it's a hell no, this isn't for me, then those people, we don't want them to listen to our show. So, and they're an obvious pass by. So that's the second symptom, is if the ideal listener that you're trying to get is finding you on Apple Podcasts, but they're doing a search, your show's popping up, and they aren't attracted by that title because they have no idea what it means. And you could test this out. Go and survey some people. Go into a Facebook group. Go, if you have friends or family that could be ideal listeners or represent your ideal listener group, put your show title in front of them. And this is the third symptom. If you have to spend any amount of time explaining what the show is about, if you have to go into a 5-minute explainer video of what the title means and who it's for, then you need to rebrand your freaking show. Like, this is not good. Because again, you don't want to do all that work, have your show pop up in front of the right people, and then they don't get it. All right. So those are the 3 symptoms that you may need to change the name of your show. Now, good news. If you are feeling these symptoms, if you're like, oh my God, I think I need to rebrand, I think I need to change the name of my show, next week's episode, we're going to deep dive on rebranding. All right. It's been a while since I've done this. This is something I've been doing a ton of paid consultations, paid coaching sessions on rebrands, and I'm pretty damn good at it. So I've got a formula. I've got a process of how to roll it out. I've got a process on the naming, even like your show podcast art. We need to dial that in as well. And we're going to cover that. We're going to dive deep on that next week. So sit tight, show up again next Tuesday, and that episode will come fresh out of the oven just for you. Now, as far as homework goes, I want you to talk to your clients. I want you to talk again to that ideal listener group and quiz them about the name of your show. Do you have to explain it? Do they get it? Even ask them, like, if they were looking for a show like yours, what would they put into Apple Podcasts? What would they put into Spotify in that search bar? What words would you put in there? Put a survey out on Instagram, put a survey out in a Facebook group, put a survey out in your newsletter, survey your current clients, and ask them that information. If you were trying to find a show like mine, what would you search in Apple Podcasts? What would you search in Spotify? And lock into those keywords and those terms, and then ask yourself, are these words showing up anywhere in my branding? Especially my podcast title, the name of my show. All right, so that's a little homework for you. Now, let's talk about the podcast description in your host. So what I mean by host is, like, I use Libsyn. That's one host. Buzzsprout is another host that's very popular. Anchor is another one that I don't like, so I won't talk about it very much. But it is a host. It's an example of a host. So in each host, there'll be a page where you can put the name of your show, and then underneath that is the description of your show. And that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about individual episodes yet. I'm just talking about the description of your show in your podcast host, like Libsyn or Buzzsprout. All right. So with that, what I usually recommend with my clients when we're doing a little bit of SEO work is I want a general description paragraph, and it's keyword rich. So all these keywords that we're researching and figuring out that our people are searching for on podcast player apps, we're going to stuff those into this initial paragraph. And I like using an XYZ formula to kick it off. If you aren't sure how to frame this, use my XYZ formula. So the goal of this show is to help X to do Y so that they can Z. An example for my show would be the goal of this show is to help podcasters increase their downloads and audience engagement so they can build a successful podcasting business. help X to do Y so that they can Z. And then thicken that up a little bit with a little bit about your background, your experience, but just think keyword, keyword, keyword everywhere in that paragraph. 3, 4, maybe 5 sentences. Then underneath that, this is a newer technique I've been using. I picked this one up on Clubhouse. Shout out to all my pod pals on Clubhouse. But I want you to add 5 to 10 Google questions. All right. Google will pick up terms and start recommending individual podcast episodes and podcasts and just shows in general. All right. So I want you to use Google questions or questions that your ideal audience members might be entering into Google to find information like what you're covering in your show. All right. So, and the way you frame this, you have your initial paragraph up top, then underneath, you could say something like, if you find yourself asking questions like these, then this show is for you. And then just list all the questions. So for my show, it's going to be, how do I launch a podcast? How do I make money as a podcaster? How do I grow my podcast audience? How do I get more engagement with my podcast? How do I market a podcast? These are all the Google questions that people like you are entering into search engines and looking for answers. So by having these in my host description, all those keywords are in there. So my information is going to be put in front of people like you. All right. And this is something that I've done this year. I really noticed a big difference. Like I mentioned earlier, my ideal potential clients are finding my show because of this type of a technique. All right. So in your host, again, general description, paragraph, XYZ formula. Below that, if you find yourself asking questions such as the following, then this show is probably for you. And then just stuff those Google questions in there. And that's really going to be beneficial. So that's the podcast description inside of your host. Now, the third zone that we want to look at is actually the individual podcast episode titles. And this is really important again, because Google is going to start, it is recommending episodes, individual episodes of shows, just like a YouTube video or a blog. Now your episodes will pull up. Hopefully if you search, how to monetize a podcast, then one of my episodes or many of my episodes will get pushed out in your Google search, whether it's via my YouTube or via the show or whatever. So that is very important as far as looking at keywords for our episode titles. Now, I know a lot of you are doing interviews and maybe you've got a big name person. So you have to think about what the name of your show. We want keywords. We also want to be just mindful and aware of when that title shows up in a podcast player app, how much is being seen, and pay attention to that real estate. So if you have big, fancy, famous person that's dropping 5 tips on how to launch your podcast, then I would title the episode with the episode number, like I always recommend, big, fancy, famous person's name, and then 5 tips to launch your podcast or whatever the episode title is with keywords. Now, if they're not so fancy and famous, I would put the keyword rich phrase first with XYZ person. And that person's name, if they're fancy and famous, that's going to be a major attractant for people to see that and listen to that episode. Put their name first, then the episode title. If they're not so fancy and famous, then I tend to list the keywords first and then with that person. So you have to think, like, what's more important with this individual episode as far as when people see it on their Apple Podcasts or Spotify, what words do I want them to see most of? What words do I want them to see first? The person or the keywords? And that's just going to be an individual call that you have to make with every single episode that you do an interview. Now, if you've got super long episode titles, make sure that the keywords are towards the beginning so that people are seeing that, because not the whole title won't be visible in most podcast player apps. So if you're on Overcast or Apple or Spotify, it's a little bit different, and depending on what kind of a device you're on, but most of the time they won't see the entire episode title. So make sure the good stuff is up front so that you are like, okay, they're seeing that for sure. That's important. Plus the keywords help with SEO. Now, we can also use our Google questions here as episode titles. All right. So think about the Google questions that you put in your podcast host description, and then add things like how to, or 7 tips for, or 10 ideas about, and then put the Google question behind that. 10 ideas to help you launch your podcast. how to launch a podcast in 7 simple steps, 7 tips to monetize a podcast. So those types of episode titles, they're attractive. Those are the right fishing lures that we want to put out there, but they're also SEO keyword rich. And that's the right amount of herbs and spices. You want to think, what is attractive? What's that title or that name or that word that's going to perk your ideal listener's ears up? But then what also is going to work from an SEO perspective? And we just can't get all weird with our episode titles and the name of our show and even the description stuff. It can't be this weird theoretical inside joke write-up or whatever. You've probably heard me talk about this on the podcast Audits before, but I'm like, hey, let's be kind of vanilla and very direct and SEO and keyword focused on our titles and our show name and all that, and then get really creative with the content. So when I'm talking to you now, I can be as creative as I want. I can drop all sorts of ideas and concepts and get weird if I want to, but that means nothing if I've got a weird title or a weird name on my show with no keywords, no SEO, and none of the right people find it because of that. Getting your show in front of the right people is really hard. It's a slow churn and a slow build for 99.9% of podcasters like you and me. And we have to work so freaking hard. Don't make it harder by having zero search engine optimization, by having zero keywords, by having weird show names and titles. Just don't do that. Make it easier on yourself, not harder, pod pals. So those are 3 zones that, when people sit down and we do a consultation around rebranding, around SEO, usually that's kind of a mixed coaching session that I offer. Like, we dive deep on this stuff. So that is something, if you're interested, hit me up, podcastingbusinessschool@gmail.com, or you can do a little consultation off the main website, podcastingbusiness.school. You can figure out what the right fit is for you if you're interested in working together, if you need a little extra help. Like I said, next week, 1 week from today, if you're listening to it on the day of release, I'm going to dive deep on rebranding, and you're going to get a lot of money's worth of value out of that one, especially if you're like, this sounds like I need to rebrand. And I got to tell you, when it comes to rebranding, if you are feeling misaligned, if you feel like you aren't quite talking about what you wish you were talking about, if you feel like you aren't quite talking to the person that you wish you were talking to, that little voice is in your head, like the alignment is out of groove, then you need to seriously consider rebranding, whether it's about SEO or not. Because when you nail that and when you get back into the groove and you're realigned with your content and you're speaking to the right person, you're speaking about the things that you feel like you need to be speaking about, it feels so much better. And I had a client recently, we did a full rebrand of her show, and she started doing episodes under the new brand and the new title, all the new colors and the whole thing. And the right people immediately started finding her show. Her downloads went up, but she started getting clients almost immediately. And our next coaching session, she got emotional. She was, tearing up a little bit. And that's how good this feels when you are putting so much effort into a thing and you feel like that effort is being maximized. If you don't have your SEO dialed in, you aren't maximizing that effort. You're wasting your time. You're wasting your potential, the potential of your show and the potential of who you could impact. So this is a serious topic. I hope you took it to heart. If you feel like you need to rebrand, I got your back. We're going to talk about it next week in the next episode. Pod pals, I appreciate you so much. I'm having so much fun. I'm getting great feedback off of the additional solo episodes I've been doing. I've got some great content coming out. It's like recess. Every time I flip on this microphone, I'm excited as hell to talk to you, to deliver for you and share some ideas. And it always means a lot when you reach out on Instagram or kick me an email and let me know that it's making a difference. So don't be shy. Hit that reply, as I say in my newsletter. And I would love to connect with you. So that all being said, I think it's time to wrap up the show. I'm going to send you out into the world wishing you health, happiness, and many downloads. We'll see you next week.